The first bullet of dust kicked up near Hope Calloway's boots as she walked briskly down the main street of Silver Creek. It was a warning shot, as clear as if someone had shouted at her to stop, but Hope kept moving, her chin held high despite the tears stinging her eyes. The second bullet struck closer, grazing the toe of her worn leather shoe, and only then did she pause, turning to face the group of sneering young men leaning against the general store's wooden porch. "Look here, boys," Tucker Wilkins called out, spinning his pistol on his finger before holstering it with a flourish. "Even the dirt don't want to be near Hope less Calloway." Laughter erupted from the group. Hope stood perfectly still, her plain brown dress hanging limply on her thin frame, her mousy hair pulled back in a severe bun that did nothing to soften her angular features. At 22, she had long accepted that she wasn't blessed with beauty like some of the other girls in town, but the constant reminders cut deep nonetheless. "Got nothing to say, plain Jane," another voice called out. "Maybe that's why your pa ran off with that saloon girl. Even he couldn't stand looking at you each morning." Hope's hand instinctively reached for the locket around her neck, the only memento she had of her mother who had died bringing her into this world. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. Not today. Not after everything else. "I have work to attend to," she said quietly, her voice barely carrying across the dusty street. Unlike some who seemed to have nothing better to do than torment others. Hope turned away, continuing her path toward Mrs. Hargrove's boarding house, where she had secured employment as a housekeeper after her father had abandoned her 3 months prior, leaving behind nothing but debts and a crumbling homestead. "Work?" Tucker laughed. "Who'd hire something as plain as you except out of pity? Even the blind man asks for you to stand farther away." The cruelty was nothing new. Hope had endured their taunts since childhood, when the other girls would refuse to play with her, claiming her plainness might be catching. As they grew older, the teasing had only grown more vicious, especially after her father left town with Scarlett, the beautiful dancer from the Red Feather Saloon. Hope hurried her pace, eager to escape their jeers. She rounded the corner past the blacksmith shop when she collided with something solid, a broad chest covered in a dust-covered denim shirt. Strong hands reached out to steady her before she could stumble backward. "Whoa there," a deep voice said. "You all right, miss?" Hope looked up into the face of a man she'd never seen before. He was tall, with a strong jaw shadowed by several days' growth of beard. His eyes were the color of the sky just after a storm, deep blue with hints of gray. A worn cowboy hat sat atop his head, casting shadows across features that had clearly seen their share of sun and hardship. "I'm fine," Hope said quickly, stepping back from his grasp. "Excuse me." The stranger glanced over her shoulder at the group of men who were still laughing and watching from a distance. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Those fellows giving you trouble?" he asked, his hand moving instinctively toward the revolver holstered at his hip. "Nothing I'm not used to," Hope replied, straightening her shoulders. "Thank you for your concern, but I can handle myself." The stranger studied her for a moment, something unreadable in his expression. "I'm sure you can. Name's Flynn Thornton," he said, extending a hand. "Just rode into town looking for work." Hope hesitated before briefly shaking his hand. "Hope Calloway. If you're looking for work, you might try the Miller Ranch just north of town. I heard they're short-handed since the cattle drive." Flynn nodded, his eyes still on her face, making Hope uncomfortable. She was used to people looking at her and quickly glancing away, not this direct, unwavering gaze. "Much obliged, Miss Calloway." His voice was warm, rich like honey over rough gravel. Hope nodded curtly and stepped around him, continuing on her way. She could feel his eyes on her back as she walked away, and something about his gaze felt different from the others she was accustomed to. There was no mockery in it, no pity, just interest. She pushed the thought aside. A handsome cowboy like Flynn Thornton wouldn't spare more than a passing glance at someone as plain as her. Men like him always gravitated toward the pretty girls at the saloon, or the banker's daughter with her perfect blonde ringlets and rosy cheeks. Hope arrived at Mrs. Hargrove's boarding house and slipped in through the back door. She had 4 rooms to clean and sheets to wash before the stage arrived with new guests. Work was her salvation, the one thing that allowed her mind to quiet. "There you are, girl," Mrs. Hargrove called from the kitchen. "I was beginning to think you'd forgotten your duties." "No, madam," Hope replied, reaching for her apron. "Just got delayed in town." "Those hooligans bothering you again?" Mrs. Hargrove asked, her hands deep in bread dough. Though stern, the older woman had shown Hope more kindness than most in Silver Creek. "Nothing worth mentioning," Hope said, securing her apron strings. "Which rooms need attention first?" "Start with number 4. The Hendersons are arriving on the afternoon stage." Mrs. Hargrove eyed her critically. "And do something with your hair, girl. You look like you've been dragged through a thorn bush backward." Hope nodded, touching her disheveled bun self-consciously. Mrs. Hargrove wasn't being unkind, just practical. Appearances mattered in her line of work, even for a housekeeper. As Hope climbed the stairs with her cleaning supplies, she heard the front door open and a familiar deep voice inquire about a room. Her heart skipped as Flynn Thornton's voice carried up the stairwell. "Just passing through, Mrs. Hargrove was asking." "Depends," Flynn replied. "Might stay a spell if I find work at the Miller place." "Well, we've got room number 2 available. $5 a week, includes breakfast, supper's extra." "Sounds fair," Flynn said. "I'll take it." Hope hurried into room 4, not wanting to be caught eavesdropping. But as she stripped the bed linens, her mind kept returning to the strange cowboy with the storm-blue eyes who had looked at her, truly looked at her without a trace of mockery or disdain. It meant nothing, she told herself firmly. In Silver Creek, men like Flynn Thornton didn't notice women like Hope Calloway. Not in any way that mattered. The sun was setting when Hope finished her duties at the boarding house. Her back ached from scrubbing floors and her hands were red and raw from washing linens, but Mrs. Hargrove had paid her the promised $2, enough to buy supplies for the coming week. Hope pulled her worn shawl around her shoulders as she started the long walk back to the tiny cabin she now called home. Her father's debts had cost them the family homestead, but Sheriff Davis had taken pity on her and allowed her to stay in an abandoned trapper's cabin on the edge of town. It wasn't much, a single room with a leaky roof and drafty windows, but it was shelter, and Hope had managed to make it somewhat comfortable with the few possessions she'd been able to salvage. The main street was alive with activity as she passed through town. The saloon doors swung open frequently, spilling light, music, and boisterous laughter into the night. Hope kept her head down, hoping to avoid any further encounters with Tucker and his friends, who were likely to be drinking by now, their cruelty amplified by whiskey. She had nearly made it past when she heard her name called out. "Miss Calloway." Flynn Thornton approached from across the street, tipping his hat as he came to stand beside her. In the dim light from the storefronts, his features seemed softer, his eyes reflecting the golden glow of the lanterns. "Mr. Thornton," she acknowledged, clutching her shawl tighter. "I wanted to thank you for the recommendation," he said. "Rode out to the Miller place this afternoon. They've hired me on as a ranch hand." "I'm glad it worked out for you," Hope replied, genuinely pleased but still guarded. "Headed home?" he asked, glancing down the dark road that led to the outskirts of town. "Yes," Hope said simply, not elaborating on her living situation. Flynn frowned slightly. It's getting dark. Would you mind if I walked with you? These streets can get rowdy at night. Hope's immediate instinct was to refuse. She was used to taking care of herself, and having someone, especially a handsome man like Flynn, offer assistance felt foreign, almost suspicious. "That's kind but unnecessary," she said. "I make this walk every evening." "All the more reason you shouldn't have to do it alone," Flynn insisted gently. "I promise I won't be a bother. Just want to make sure you get home safe." Before Hope could protest further, a raucous group burst from the saloon, Tucker Wilkins among them. His eyes landed on Hope, then narrowed when he noticed Flynn beside her. "Well, if it ain't Hopeless and the new saddle tramp," Tucker called, swaggering toward them. The smell of cheap whiskey preceded him. "You lowering your standards already, Cowboy? Though I suppose when you're fresh off the trail, even a plain Jane might look appealing." Hope felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but before she could speak, Flynn stepped slightly in front of her. "Might want to mind your manners, friend," Flynn said quietly, his tone pleasant but his eyes hard as flint. "The lady deserves your respect." Tucker snorted. "Lady, that's charitable." He leaned to look around Flynn at Hope. "Did you tell him about your pa? How he couldn't stand the sight of you so much he ran off with the first pretty face that smiled his way?" Hope felt something inside her crumple. Tucker's words hit their mark as they always did, finding the tenderest bruises on her heart and pressing hard. Flynn's hand moved to his gun belt, not drawing but making his intentions clear. "I won't ask again," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Apologize to the lady and move along." The tension stretched between them like a bowstring pulled taut. Hope held her breath, torn between mortification and a strange, unfamiliar feeling of being defended. Tucker glanced at Flynn's hand, then at his own friends who had grown unusually quiet, sensing the shift in the air. After a moment, Tucker stepped back, raising his hands in mock surrender. "No need to get riled up over nothing," he said with a forced laugh. "Just having some fun. No harm meant." "Good," Flynn said, not relaxing his stance. "Now I believe an apology is in order." Tucker's expression hardened, but he muttered, "Sorry, Hope," before turning back to his friends, throwing one last venomous glance over his shoulder. Once they had moved far enough away, Hope released the breath she'd been holding. "You shouldn't have done that," she said softly. Flynn turned to face her, surprise evident in his features. "Why not?" "Because I have to live here," Hope explained. "Long after you've moved on, I'll still be here and they'll only be worse once you're gone." Flynn considered this, then shook his head. "No man worth his salt stands by while a lady is insulted. My ma would tan my hide even now if I did." Hope couldn't help the small smile that tugged at her lips. "Your mother sounds formidable." "She was," Flynn agreed, his expression softening with memory. "Raised 3 boys on her own after my pa died in the war. Taught us that strength isn't about how hard you can hit, but whether you stand up when it matters." The simple sincerity in his voice touched something in Hope. "Thank you," she said after a moment, "for standing up when it mattered." Flynn offered his arm. "Now about that walk home." This time Hope accepted, placing her hand lightly on his forearm. They walked in companionable silence for a while, the sounds of town gradually fading behind them. "How long have you been on the trail?" Hope asked eventually, curious despite herself. "Almost 2 years now," Flynn replied. "Worked cattle drives in Texas, did some breaking of horses in New Mexico territory, just following the work mostly. No place to call home." Flynn glanced at her, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Home's a complicated notion for a man like me, but I reckon it's time I started looking for one." Hope nodded, not sure how to respond to the warmth in his voice. They continued walking until they reached the small cabin. In the moonlight, all its flaws were starkly visible: the crooked chimney, the patched roof, the single window with its cracked pane. "This is me," Hope said, embarrassment coloring her voice as she withdrew her hand from his arm. Flynn surveyed the cabin without judgment. "Looks sturdy enough. Good sight lines, too. You can see anyone approaching from a fair distance." His matter-of-fact assessment, free of pity, was a balm to Hope's pride. "It serves its purpose," she agreed. "Thank you for walking me home, Mr. Thornton." "Flynn," he corrected gently. "And it was my pleasure, Miss Calloway." "Hope," she returned, surprising herself. Flynn smiled, and even in the dim light, Hope could see how it transformed his face, creating crinkles at the corners of his eyes. "Hope," he repeated, as if testing the feel of her name. "It suits you." With a tip of his hat, he turned to leave, then paused. "Would it be presumptuous of me to ask if I might walk you home again tomorrow, after your work is done?" Hope's heart fluttered in a way she hadn't experienced before. Caution warred with a yearning she hardly recognized. "I wouldn't want to impose on your time." "No imposition," Flynn assured her. "I'd consider it an honor." Hope hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Then yes, that would be nice." Flynn's smile widened. "Until tomorrow, then. Good night, Hope." "Good night, Flynn." Hope watched him walk back toward town, his figure gradually dissolving into the darkness. Only when he had completely disappeared did she enter her cabin, lighting a small lamp that cast a warm glow over the sparse interior. As she prepared for bed, Hope couldn't stop her thoughts from returning to Flynn Thornton, the mysterious cowboy who had looked at her plain, ordinary Hope Calloway as if she were worth seeing. She told herself not to read too much into his kindness. Men like Flynn were often courteous by nature, raised to treat all women with respect regardless of their appearance. Yet as she drifted off to sleep, Hope allowed herself a small, secret hope that perhaps, just perhaps, there might be something more to his interest than mere politeness. The following weeks brought an unexpected rhythm to Hope's life. True to his word, Flynn walked her home each evening after her work at the boarding house. Their conversations flowed more easily with each passing day, and Hope found herself sharing stories of her childhood in Silver Creek, the good memories, before her mother's death had changed everything. Flynn, in turn, told her of his travels across the Western Territories, of cattle drives beneath star-filled skies and the characters he'd met along the way. He spoke of his brothers, one a blacksmith in Missouri, the other a school teacher in Oregon, and of his dream to someday have land of his own. "Not a big spread," he explained one evening as they walked along the creek that gave the town its name. "Just enough for a decent herd, a good horse or two, and a place to put down roots." "It sounds wonderful," Hope said, imagining such a life. She had stopped at the water's edge, watching the last rays of sunset shimmer on the surface. Flynn stood beside her, closer than propriety might dictate, but Hope found she didn't mind. "What about you?" he asked. "What dreams keep Hope Calloway going?" The question caught her off guard. No one had ever asked about her dreams before. For so long, she had focused merely on survival, on enduring one day at a time. "I'm not sure I remember how to dream," she admitted softly. "After Mother died, Father changed. The homestead began to fail, and then—" She trailed off, not wanting to revisit the painful memory of her father's abandonment. Flynn's hand found hers, his calloused palm warm against her skin. "Maybe it's time to remember," he suggested gently. Hope looked down at their joined hands, then up at Flynn's face. In the fading light, his expression was so earnest, so free of the mockery she had come to expect, that something tight within her chest began to loosen. "I always wanted to learn to play the piano," she confessed, the words rushing out before she could reconsider. And to have a garden full of wildflowers, not just vegetables, and maybe a family of my own someday. She immediately felt foolish for voicing such ordinary desires, but Flynn nodded, his eyes warm. Those sound like fine dreams to me, especially the wildflowers. They're honest flowers, they don't put on airs like those hothouse roses in the city. His simple validation of her modest aspirations touched Hope deeply. For a moment, they stood in silence, hands still joined, as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "I should get you home," Flynn said finally, though he seemed reluctant to move. "Mrs. Hargrove mentioned you start early tomorrow." Hope nodded, equally hesitant to end their time together. As they walked the remaining distance to her cabin, Flynn kept hold of her hand, his thumb occasionally brushing over her knuckles in a gesture that sent pleasant shivers up her arm. At her door, Flynn released her hand but didn't step back. "Hope," he began, then paused, uncharacteristically hesitant. "Would you allow me to call on you properly? Perhaps this Sunday we could attend church together." Hope's heart lurched in her chest. Attending church together was a public declaration of interest, a statement to the entire town that Flynn Thornton was courting Hope Calloway. "Are you certain?" she asked, unable to keep the doubt from her voice. "People will talk." Flynn's expression grew serious. "Let them talk. I'd be proud to escort you." Hope searched his face for any sign of insincerity and found none. "Then yes," she said, a smile blooming despite her best efforts to temper her expectations. "I would like that very much." Flynn's answering smile was bright enough to rival the stars overhead. "Sunday, then. I'll come by at 9. He hesitated, then leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to her cheek. "Good night, Hope." "Good night, Flynn," she whispered, her skin tingling where his lips had touched. After he left, Hope touched her fingertips to her cheek, scarcely believing what had transpired. No man had ever shown interest in courting her before. The logical part of her mind warned that it couldn't possibly last, that Flynn would eventually see what everyone else in Silver Creek saw: a plain, unremarkable woman not worth loving. But another part, a part that had lain dormant for years, dared to believe that perhaps Flynn saw something in her that others had missed. It was a dangerous hope, fraught with the potential for heartbreak, but Hope found herself nurturing it nonetheless. Sunday arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers from the surrounding hills. Hope had risen before dawn, heating water for a proper bath, washing her hair with the lavender soap she'd been saving for a special occasion. She dressed in her best dress, a pale blue calico that her mother had sewn years ago, and arranged her hair more carefully than usual, allowing a few soft tendrils to frame her face instead of pulling it all back severely. When Flynn knocked on her door precisely at 9, Hope's hands trembled as she opened it. He stood on her threshold in a clean white shirt, dark vest, and polished boots, his normally unruly hair tamed and his face freshly shaven. In his hand, he held a small bouquet of wildflowers. "Good morning," he said, his eyes taking in her appearance with obvious appreciation. "You look beautiful, Hope." The compliment, delivered with such sincerity, brought a flush to Hope's cheeks. "Thank you," she replied, accepting the wildflowers. "These are lovely." "Not as lovely as the lady therefore," Flynn said, offering his arm. "Shall we?" Hope quickly placed the flowers in a jar of water before taking his arm, her heart racing at the prospect of facing the town on Flynn's arm. The walk to the small white church at the center of Silver Creek felt both interminable and far too brief. As they approached, Hope could feel eyes turning toward them, could hear the whispers starting. "Is that Hope Calloway with the new ranch hand? What's a handsome fellow like him doing with her? Must be feeling sorry for her after what her pa did." Hope's steps faltered, but Flynn's hand covered hers where it rested on his arm, his touch reassuring. "Don't give them the satisfaction," he murmured, just loud enough for her to hear. "Hold your head high. You've nothing to be ashamed of." Drawing strength from his confidence, Hope straightened her shoulders and continued forward. They entered the church together, finding a seat near the middle. Several people openly stared, including Tucker Wilkins and his cronies, but Flynn met their gazes unflinchingly until they looked away. As the service began, Hope gradually relaxed, finding comfort in the familiar hymns and prayers. Flynn sang beside her, his deep voice blending with hers in a way that felt right, as if they'd been attending church together for years rather than minutes. After the service, they stood in the churchyard, accepting congratulations from the few genuinely kind souls in town, including Mrs. Hargrove, who gave Flynn an approving nod before moving on. "Miss Calloway," a voice called, and Hope turned to see Mrs. Miller approaching with her husband. As the wife of Flynn's employer, Mrs. Miller was a woman of considerable influence in Silver Creek. "Mrs. Miller," Hope greeted, anxiety returning. "I see you've become acquainted with our new ranch hand," Mrs. Miller said, her tone neutral but her eyes sharp and assessing. "Yes, madam," Hope replied. "Mr. Thornton has been kind enough to escort me today." Mrs. Miller studied them both for a moment before a smile softened her features. "Well, isn't that lovely? Mr. Thornton has proven himself a hard worker and a skilled horseman. We're fortunate to have him." Mr. Miller nodded in agreement. "Indeed. In fact, we were hoping to convince him to stay on permanently. Silver Creek could use more young men of character." Flynn inclined his head. "I appreciate that, sir. I've been giving serious thought to putting down roots in these parts." His words sent a flutter of excitement through Hope's chest, though she cautioned herself not to read too much into them. Putting down roots didn't necessarily mean including her in his plans. The Millers moved on, but not before Mrs. Miller leaned close to Hope and whispered, "He hasn't taken his eyes off you once. Quite refreshing to see a young man who knows the value of substance over mere appearances." As the crowd thinned, Tucker Wilkins approached, his usual swagger tempered somewhat by the churchyard setting and the presence of the town elders nearby. Hope tensed, but Flynn's hand at the small of her back steadied her. "Thornton," Tucker acknowledged stiffly, then turned to Hope with a forced smile. "Miss Calloway, fine service today." Hope blinked, surprised by the civil greeting. "Yes, it was," she agreed cautiously. Tucker cleared his throat. "I wanted to apologize proper for my behavior the other night. It was unbecoming." The apology, clearly reluctant and likely prompted by Flynn's growing reputation at the Miller Ranch, was nevertheless unexpected. Hope nodded, not quite trusting herself to speak. Flynn's hand remained a warm presence on her back. "Apology accepted, I'm sure," he said smoothly. "We all have moments we're not proud of." Tucker gave a curt nod and walked away, his shoulders tight with unspoken resentment. "That was unexpected," Hope murmured once he was out of earshot. Flynn's lips quirked in a half-smile. "Word travels fast. Mr. Miller doesn't tolerate his hands causing trouble in town, especially with ladies. I suspect Tucker was advised to make amends if he wants to keep his seasonal work at the ranch. Still," Hope mused, "I never thought I'd see the day when Tucker Wilkins apologized to me for anything." Flynn's expression softened as he gazed down at her. "You deserve more than apologies, Hope. You deserve respect." The simple statement, delivered with such conviction, warmed Hope from within. As they walked away from the church, Flynn suggested a picnic by the creek, producing a basket he had apparently arranged with Mrs. Hargrove's help. They spent the afternoon in the dappled shade of cottonwood trees, sharing a meal of fried chicken, biscuits, and apple pie. Flynn told her stories of his childhood in Kentucky, of learning to ride almost before he could walk, of his mother's determination to ensure her sons could read and cipher even when formal schooling was interrupted by the war. In return, Hope shared memories of her mother, the songs she would sing while working, her talent for making something beautiful out of the most ordinary materials, her dreams of seeing Hope grow into a confident woman with a loving family of her own. "She sounds like an extraordinary woman," Flynn said when Hope fell silent. "I wish I could have known her." Hope smiled sadly. "She would have liked you, I think. She always said the measure of a man was in how he treated those who could do nothing for him." Flynn reached across the picnic blanket, taking her hand in his. "Is that what you think this is?" he asked quietly. "That I'm being kind because you can do nothing for me?" Hope's gaze dropped to their joined hands. "I don't know what to think," she admitted. "No one in Silver Creek has ever looked twice at me except to mock. Then you arrive and suddenly—" She trailed off, unable to articulate the confusion and hope warring within her. "Look at me, Hope," Flynn said gently. When she raised her eyes to his, the intensity she found there took her breath away. Flynn moved closer, still holding her hand. "From the moment I saw you walking down that street, head high despite those fools trying to tear you down, I knew you were someone special," he said. "Not because you needed saving, you've been saving yourself long before I came along, but because of the strength it takes to face each day with dignity when the world seems determined to strip it away." He released her hand only to touch her cheek, his calloused fingers unexpectedly tender. "You call yourself plain. Maybe that's what those small-minded people see, but plain looks like heaven from where I stand." Hope's heart stumbled in her chest. "You can't mean that," she whispered, though she desperately wanted to believe him. "I've never meant anything more," Flynn replied, his gaze unwavering. "I've seen beautiful women from San Antonio to San Francisco, Hope, and not one of them has made me feel the way I do when I look at you." Before Hope could respond, Flynn leaned forward, hesitating just a breath away from her lips, giving her time to pull back if she wished. Instead, Hope closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that started gentle but quickly deepened as Flynn's arms encircled her, drawing her closer. When they finally broke apart, Hope was breathless, her heart racing like a runaway horse. Flynn's eyes were dark with an emotion she was only beginning to recognize, his hand still warm on her waist. "I'm falling in love with you, Hope Calloway," he said, his voice rough with feeling. "And if you'll let me, I aim to spend however long it takes convincing you that you're worth loving." Hope's vision blurred with tears she couldn't contain. No one had ever spoken to her with such reverence, such certainty. It terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. "I'm afraid," she confessed, her voice barely audible above the gentle burbling of the creek beside them. "Of what?" Flynn asked, brushing a tear from her cheek with his thumb. "That I'll wake up and this will have been a dream," Hope said. "Or that you'll wake up and realize I'm not what you thought." Flynn shook his head, a small smile playing at his lips. "I'm not a man given to romantic fancies, Hope. What I feel for you is real, and it grows stronger each day." He leaned his forehead against hers, their breath mingling in the small space between them. "I don't need you to say it back," he murmured. "Not until you're ready. Just give me a chance to prove I mean what I say." Hope closed her eyes, allowing herself to sink into the moment, to believe, if only for now, that Flynn Thornton saw something in her worth loving. "Yes," she whispered. "I'd like that." Flynn's answering kiss sealed a promise between them, one that Hope carried in her heart as they packed up their picnic and walked hand in hand back toward town, uncaring of the curious glances and whispers that followed in their wake. The weeks that followed were the happiest of Hope's life. Flynn called on her regularly, escorting her not only to church, but also to social gatherings she had previously avoided. At the town's harvest dance, he led her onto the floor with such pride in his expression that Hope momentarily forgot her self-consciousness, allowing herself to enjoy the simple pleasure of being in his arms, moving to the lively music. Tucker and his friends kept their distance, their previous mockery reduced to occasional dark looks from across the street. Mrs. Hargrove, seeing Hope's blossoming happiness, reduced her workload slightly, encouraging her to enjoy being courted properly for once. One crisp autumn evening, as they sat on the small porch Flynn had built onto her cabin, "Just to give you a proper place to sit and watch the sunset," he'd explained, though Hope knew it was his way of improving her living conditions without wounding her pride. Hope realized with startling clarity that she had fallen in love with him. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic revelation, just a quiet certainty that settled over her as Flynn described his day at the ranch, his face animated in the golden light of the setting sun. She loved his kindness, his integrity, the way he treated everyone from the town drunk to the mayor's wife with the same respectful courtesy. She loved his hands, strong but gentle, capable of breaking a wild horse yet tender when they held hers. She loved his laugh, his stories, the dreams he shared so openly with her. "Flynn," she interrupted softly, her heart pounding. He paused, turning to face her. "Yes." Hope took a deep breath. "I love you," she said simply, the words feeling both terrifying and absolutely right as they left her lips. Flynn's expression transformed, joy illuminating his features like sunrise breaking over the mountains. He reached for her, pulling her into his arms with a gentleness that belied his strength. "Say it again," he whispered against her hair. Hope smiled, her earlier nervousness fading in the warmth of his embrace. "I love you, Flynn Thornton." Flynn drew back just enough to look into her eyes, his own shining with emotion. "Those are the sweetest words I've ever heard," he said. "And I love you, Hope Calloway, more than I thought possible." His kiss was tender at first, then grew more insistent as Hope responded, her arms winding around his neck, her body molding against his as if they were two halves of a whole finally reunited. When they finally parted, both breathless, Flynn kept her close, his forehead resting against hers. "Marry me," he said, the words more declaration than question. Hope drew back slightly, searching his face. "Are you sure?" she asked, old doubts resurfacing despite herself. "This town, I don't care what anyone in this town thinks," Flynn interrupted firmly. "I love you. I want to build a life with you, Hope. A home, a family, everything we've talked about." Hope's heart soared at his words, at the certainty in his voice. "Yes," she said, a smile breaking across her face like dawn. "Yes, I'll marry you." Flynn's whoop of joy startled a nesting bird from a nearby tree. He lifted Hope off her feet, spinning her in a circle that left her laughing and clinging to his shoulders. When he set her down, his expression grew serious once more. "I don't have much yet," he admitted. "The Millers have offered me a permanent position with a small cabin on their property, but eventually I want land of our own." "I don't need much," Hope assured him. "Just you." Flynn kissed her again, briefly but with feeling. "You'll have all of me always. And I promise, one day you'll have that garden full of wildflowers and a piano to play in the evenings." The sincerity of his promise brought tears to Hope's eyes. For so long, she had resigned herself to a life of solitude, convinced that love and family were luxuries not meant for plain, unremarkable Hope Calloway. Now, standing in the arms of a man who looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in his world, Hope allowed herself to believe in the future they would build together. "When?" she asked, practical concerns asserting themselves through her happiness. "When should we marry?" Flynn considered. How about Christmas? The Millers always give the hands a few days off, and the cabin would be ready by then. Christmas, Hope repeated, imagining a winter wedding with evergreen boughs and candles illuminating the small church. It's perfect. As the sun disappeared below the horizon, painting the sky in deepening shades of purple and gold, Flynn and Hope remained on the porch, planning their future together in quiet voices punctuated by laughter and occasional kisses. For the first time in her life, Hope felt truly seen, truly valued for exactly who she was. Word of their engagement spread quickly through Silver Creek. Most reactions were positive misses. Hargrove beamed with almost maternal pride when Hope shared the news, and the Millers offered their blessing along with the promise of a proper wedding gift. Not everyone was supportive, of course. Hope overheard whispers questioning what Flynn could possibly see in that plain Calloway girl, and suggesting he must be marrying her out of pity or for some hidden advantage. Each barbed comment stung, but Hope found that with Flynn's love as her armor, they could no longer wound her as deeply as before. One afternoon in late November, as Hope was shopping for fabric to make her wedding dress, she encountered Scarlett, the saloon girl who had left town with Hope's father months earlier. The woman looked tired, her once vibrant beauty dimmed by hardship, her expensive clothes replaced by a simple traveling dress. "Hope," Scarlett acknowledged, her voice lacking its former confidence. "I heard you were still in town." Hope nodded stiffly, unsure what to say to the woman who had contributed to her father's abandonment. "I am." Scarlett glanced around, then lowered her voice. "Your father, he's gone. Fever took him in Tucson last month." The news hit Hope with unexpected force. Despite everything, a part of her had held onto the childish hope that her father might return someday, might explain his actions, might be the parent she had desperately needed after her mother's death. "I'm sorry," Scarlett continued when Hope remained silent. He wasn't a good man in the end. He spoke of you, though, near the end, said he'd failed you." Hope closed her eyes briefly, fighting back tears. "Thank you for telling me," she managed, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. Scarlett nodded, turning to go, then hesitated. "I heard you're getting married, to that new ranch hand at the Millers." "Yes," Hope confirmed, "at Christmas." A ghost of a smile crossed Scarlett's painted lips. "Good, you deserve happiness, Hope, more than most." With that, she walked away, disappearing into the crowd on the street. Hope stood motionless for several moments, processing the news of her father's death and the unexpected kindness from the woman she had resented for so long. When she finally continued her errands, her steps were heavy with grief, not just for the father she had lost, but for the relationship that had been broken long before his departure. That evening, when Flynn came to call, Hope shared the news. They sat together on the porch swing he had built, her head resting on his shoulder as she recounted the encounter with Scarlett. "I don't know why I'm crying," Hope confessed as tears slipped down her cheeks. "He left us, left me. Why should I mourn him now?" Flynn's arm tightened around her shoulders. "Because he was your father," he said simply. "No matter what he did or didn't do, that bond exists. It's natural to grieve what was lost, both the man himself and the father he could have been." Hope nodded against his shoulder, grateful for his understanding. "I keep thinking about what Scarlett said, that he knew he'd failed me. I wish I could have told him I forgive him." Flynn pressed a kiss to her temple. "Perhaps he knew," he suggested gently. "And even if he didn't, forgiving him now in your heart is a gift you give yourself as much as his memory." They sat in companionable silence as darkness fell, Flynn's steady presence a balm to Hope's troubled spirit. Eventually, she straightened, wiping away the last of her tears. "Thank you," she said softly. for understanding, for not telling me I shouldn't feel this way." Flynn cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the dampness on her cheeks. "Your heart is one of the things I love most about you, Hope. Its capacity for forgiveness, for seeing beyond surface appearances to what matters. I would never ask you to be less than who you are." Hope leaned into his touch, drawing strength from his unwavering support. "I love you," she whispered, the words coming easier each time she said them. "And I love you," Flynn replied, sealing the promise with a tender kiss. "Always." As their wedding day approached, Hope worked diligently on her dress, using the fine cream-colored fabric she had purchased that day. Mrs. Hargrove insisted on helping, her experienced hands guiding Hope through the more intricate details of the simple but elegant design. "Every bride deserves to feel beautiful on her wedding day," Mrs. Hargrove declared as she helped Hope try on the nearly finished dress for final adjustments. "And you, my dear, will be radiant." Hope gazed at her reflection in Mrs. Hargrove's full-length mirror, hardly recognizing herself in the graceful gown with its modest lace trim and perfectly fitted bodice. The dress somehow highlighted attributes she had never noticed before: the elegant line of her neck, the gentle curves of her figure, the way her eyes seemed to shine with inner light when she thought of Flynn. "You really think so?" Hope asked, smoothing the fabric over her hips. Mrs. Hargrove stepped back, her normally stern expression softening with approval. "I know so. That young man of yours won't be able to take his eyes off you." She paused, then added more gently, "Though if I'm honest, he already looks at you that way, whether you're in finery or covered in dust from cleaning." Hope blushed, still unaccustomed to the idea that Flynn found her beautiful despite what she had always considered her plainness. "He sees me differently than others do," she acknowledged. "No," Mrs. Hargrove corrected firmly. "He sees you as you truly are, not as others have told you to see yourself. There's a world of difference there, Hope." The distinction resonated with Hope as she carefully removed the dress, thanking Mrs. Hargrove for her help. As she walked home in the fading December light, she reflected on how much had changed in the months since Flynn Thornton had ridden into Silver Creek. It wasn't just that she was no longer alone, though the companionship Flynn offered was a gift beyond measure. It was that through his eyes, Hope had begun to see herself differently, not as the plain, unworthy girl she had believed herself to be, but as someone deserving of love, capable of giving it freely in return. The transformation wasn't immediate or complete. There were still moments when old insecurities surfaced, when she caught herself wondering what Flynn could possibly see in her. But those moments grew fewer and farther between, as Hope allowed herself to trust in the love they shared. Their wedding day dawned clear and cold, the December sky a brilliant blue above the snow-dusted mountains. Hope woke early, her stomach fluttering with nervous excitement as she prepared for the day ahead. Mrs. Hargrove arrived to help her dress, bringing with her a small bouquet of hothouse flowers, a wedding gift from the Millers. "Something borrowed," Mrs. Hargrove announced, producing a delicate lace handkerchief from her pocket. "It was my mother's, and I carried it at my own wedding." Hope accepted the handkerchief with trembling fingers. "Thank you," she said, touched by the gesture, "for everything. You've been kinder to me than almost anyone in Silver Creek." Mrs. Hargrove waved away her gratitude. "You're a good girl with a kind heart. This town never appreciated your worth, but I'm glad someone finally does." She squeezed Hope's hand briefly. "Now, let's get you ready to marry that handsome cowboy of yours." The small church was filled to capacity. Not everyone in attendance was genuinely happy for the couple. But in a town the size of Silver Creek, a wedding was an event no one wanted to miss. Hope waited in a small anteroom, her heart pounding as the first notes of music signaled the beginning of the ceremony. With no father to give her away, Hope had initially planned to walk the aisle alone. But Mr. Miller had surprised her by offering his arm, his weathered face kind as he explained, "Every bride deserves to be escorted with pride on her wedding day." Now, standing at the back of the church with Mr. Miller beside her, Hope took a deep breath, steadying herself for the moment ahead. The doors opened, and every head turned to watch her entrance. Hope's gaze, however, was fixed solely on Flynn, standing tall and handsome at the altar in a new black suit, his expression transforming from nervous anticipation to awestruck wonder as he caught sight of her. In that moment, with Flynn looking at her as if she were the most beautiful woman in the world, Hope felt herself truly bloom. The whispers and stares from the congregation faded to insignificance as she walked toward the man who had taught her what it meant to be truly seen and loved. When she reached the altar, Flynn took her hands in his eyes never leaving her face. "You are so beautiful," he whispered, the words meant for her alone. "So are you," Hope replied softly, her heart overflowing with love for this man who had changed her life so completely. The ceremony itself was simple and traditional, their voices clear and steady as they exchanged vows before God and the community of Silver Creek. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Flynn's kiss was gentle but filled with promise, his hands cradling her face as if she were something precious beyond measure. The celebration afterward, held in the town hall, decorated with evergreen boughs and red ribbons for the Christmas season, was joyful and surprisingly warm. Even those who had once mocked Hope seemed caught up in the genuine happiness radiating from the newlyweds, offering congratulations that, if not entirely sincere, were at least politely delivered. Tucker Wilkins approached as Hope and Flynn shared their first dance, hovering awkwardly at the edge of the floor until the music ended. To Hope's surprise, he extended his hand not to her but to Flynn. "Congratulations," he said gruffly, shaking Flynn's hand before nodding to Hope. "Both of you." "Thank you, Tucker," Hope replied, her happiness too complete to hold onto old grievances. Tucker shifted uncomfortably, then added, "I was wrong about a lot of things. I'm sorry for how I treated you, Hope, truly." Before either Hope or Flynn could respond, Tucker walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Flynn looked down at Hope, one eyebrow raised in question. "Christmas miracle," he suggested with a small smile. Hope laughed, the sound light and carefree. "Perhaps, or maybe just growing up finally." As the celebration continued around them, Flynn led Hope to a quiet corner, his arm secure around her waist. "Happy?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. "More than I ever thought possible," Hope answered truthfully. "And you?" Flynn's smile was radiant. "Mrs. Thornton, I am the luckiest man in the Wyoming Territory, possibly in the entire United States." The name Mrs. Thornton sent a thrill through Hope. She was a wife now, Flynn's wife, with a future stretching before them full of possibilities she had never dared to imagine for herself. "I love you," she said, the words coming as naturally as breathing. Flynn's arms tightened around her. "And I love you. Plain or fancy, in sunshine or storm, I will love you every day of my life." Later that night, as they drove the short distance to the cabin on the Miller property that would be their first home together, snow began to fall, soft flakes drifting down to dust Flynn's shoulders and catch in Hope's hair. Flynn wrapped an extra blanket around her, his arm holding her close against the winter chill. "Look," he said, nodding toward their approaching home. In the pale moonlight filtering through the clouds, Hope could see a small cabin, light glowing welcomingly from its windows. As they drew closer, she gasped in surprise, On the porch stood a small piano, a red ribbon tied around it, protected from the weather by the overhanging roof. Beside it was a wooden sign freshly painted. Thornton. How? Hope breathed, tears of joy pricking her eyes. Flynn helped her down from the wagon, his expression a mix of pride and pleasure at her reaction. The Millers. They have a daughter in Denver who studied music but married and moved east. The piano's been in storage for years. When I mentioned your dream of learning to play. He shrugged, suddenly looking almost shy. Consider it both a wedding gift and the first installment on a promise. Hope approached the piano reverently, running her fingers over the smooth wood. It's beautiful, she whispered, then turned to embrace her husband fiercely. Thank you for making my dreams come true. Flynn lifted her easily into his arms, carrying her toward the threshold of their new home. This is just the beginning, Hope Thornton, he promised, his voice low and full of meaning. Just the beginning of all the dreams we'll build together. As he carried her across the threshold into the warmth and light of their home, Hope knew with absolute certainty that no matter what challenges lay ahead, she would face them with Flynn at her side. His love, a constant reminder that beauty existed in many forms, and that being seen, truly seen by one person who mattered, was worth more than the fleeting approval of 100 others. Spring came to Silver Creek in a riot of wildflowers and birdsong, transforming the landscape from the stark beauty of winter to a lush tapestry of color. Hope stood on the porch of their cabin, watching as Flynn worked in the small garden he had helped her plant along the southern edge of their property. 4 months of marriage had brought adjustments for both of them, but each day Hope fell more deeply in love with her husband. Flynn's strength wasn't just in his capable hands or broad shoulders, but in his patience, his unwavering commitment to their shared dreams, the gentle way he loved her through moments of self-doubt that still occasionally surfaced. Hope's fingers absently traced the small bump beginning to show beneath her apron, their first child, due in late autumn. They had shared the news with only a few trusted friends so far, savoring the private joy of their expanding family before announcing it to the town at large. Flynn looked up from his work, catching her watching him. A smile spread across his sun-bronzed face as he set down his tools and walked toward her, wiping his hands on a handkerchief. Admiring the view, Mrs. Thornton, he teased, climbing the steps to join her on the porch. Always, Hope replied with a smile, accepting his kiss. The garden's coming along beautifully. Flynn's hand found its way to her abdomen, resting protectively over their growing child. How are you feeling today? Any sickness? Hope covered his hand with her own. None. I think those herbs Mrs. Miller suggested are helping. Good, Flynn said, relief evident in his voice. The morning sickness that had plagued Hope during the first months of pregnancy had worried him terribly, though he had tried to hide his concern. Hope leaned into his embrace, breathing in the scent of sunshine and clean sweat that clung to him after his work outdoors. I have news, she said after a moment. Flynn drew back slightly to look at her, one eyebrow raised in question. Good news, I hope. Hope nodded. Mr. Peterson stopped by while you were in the garden. He says the land we inquired about, the old Johnson place, is available. The owner in Denver is willing to sell for the price we offered. Flynn's expression brightened. Really? That's wonderful news. He swept Hope into a careful embrace, mindful of her condition. It's perfect timing. With the bonus Mr. Miller promised for the spring drive and what we've saved, we can make the down payment and still have enough to start building before winter. The Johnson property, 160 acres of good grazing land with a year-round creek and a small stand of timber, had been their dream since shortly after their marriage. When they had first discussed the possibility of acquiring it, Hope had worried it was too ambitious, but Flynn's confidence had never wavered. "Our own land," Hope said softly, the reality of it beginning to sink in. "Our own home, to build exactly as we want it." Flynn's eyes shone with excitement and determination. "With a proper room for the piano and windows that face east so you can watch the sunrise, and a big porch where we can sit in the evenings and watch our children play." The vision he painted was so vivid Hope could almost see it their future home, filled with love and laughter, the family they would raise together. She had come so far from the lonely, insecure young woman who had walked the streets of Silver Creek with her head down, trying to avoid notice. Now she stood tall beside her husband, anticipating rather than dreading what lay ahead. "I love you, Flynn Thornton," she said, her voice full of the happiness that had become her constant companion. "Thank you for seeing me when no one else did." Flynn's expression softened, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. "I see you more clearly with each passing day," he told her. "And what I see makes me fall in love with you all over again, every morning when I wake up beside you." His kiss was tender, a reaffirmation of the promises they had made to each other on that snowy December day. When they parted, Flynn rested his forehead against hers, their breath mingling in the small space between them. "Plain looks like heaven from where I stand," he murmured, echoing words he had spoken to her during their courtship. "And you, Hope Thornton, are the most beautiful sight these eyes have ever beheld." Hope smiled, her heart full to overflowing with love for this man who had changed her world. "And you, my love, are the answer to a prayer I was too afraid to voice." Together they stood on the threshold of the future they had dreamed of, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as they had faced everything since that fateful day Flynn Thornton had ridden into Silver Creek side by side, heart to heart, seeing in each other the beauty that truly mattered. 5 years later, Hope's fingers danced across the piano keys, filling the spacious front room of the Thornton ranch house with a lively rendition of "Beautiful Dreamer." From the kitchen came the sound of childish laughter and Flynn's deep voice, exaggerated for storytelling. The home they had built on their land had exceeded even her most optimistic dreams, a sturdy 2-story structure with plenty of room for their growing family, surrounded by fields of grass where their small but thriving herd of cattle grazed. The wildflower garden Hope had planted bloomed from early spring until the first frost, a riot of color visible from the wide front porch where they often sat in the evenings. As the last notes of the song faded, 4-year-old Matthew came racing into the room, his dark hair so like his father's flopping over bright eyes that were undeniably Hope's. "Mama, play the one about the buffalo again," he requested, clambering onto the piano bench beside her. Hope laughed, dropping a kiss on his tousled head. "After supper, my love, is your father finishing up in the kitchen?" Matthew nodded vigorously. "He's helping Emma eat her stew. She's making a mess." "I heard that, young man," Flynn called from the kitchen, appearing in the doorway with their 2-year-old daughter balanced on his hip. Emma's face was indeed smeared with stew, but her smile was radiant as she reached for Hope. "Mama, piano," she demanded, wriggling to be set down. Hope opened her arms to receive her daughter, settling the toddler on her lap at the piano. "Just a short one before supper," she agreed, beginning a simple nursery tune that made Emma bounce with excitement. Flynn leaned against the doorframe, watching his family with unconcealed adoration. At 33, he was in his prime, still as handsome as the day Hope had first met him, though with a few more lines at the corners of his eyes from squinting in the sun, and perhaps a touch of gray beginning at his temples. The years of hard work building their ranch had broadened his shoulders and strengthened his hands, but those hands were still infinitely gentle when they held his children or caressed his wife. As Hope finished the short piece, Flynn straightened. "Supper's ready. Matthew, go wash your hands, please." The boy scampered off obediently, and Flynn crossed the room to take Emma from Hope's lap. "You too, little miss. Those hands need scrubbing." Hope rose from the piano bench, smoothing her skirts. At 27, she had blossomed into a confidence she had never imagined possible in her youth. Motherhood and marriage had softened some of her angular features, and the happiness that radiated from within lent a glow to her complexion that no cosmetic could replicate. Flynn leaned down to steal a quick kiss before following Matthew to help with the hand washing. "Beautiful as ever," he murmured, the compliment as sincere now as it had been when they were courting. Hope felt the familiar warmth bloom in her chest at his words. 5 years of marriage, and Flynn still looked at her as if she were the most beautiful woman in the world. It had taken time, but Hope had finally come to understand that his perception wasn't blindness or charity, it was seeing past the surface to the essence of who she was. The family gathered around the large oak table Flynn had crafted by hand the previous winter. The meal was simple but hearty: beef stew, fresh bread, and apple pie for dessert, and the conversation flowed easily between adult topics and Matthew's enthusiastic accounts of his adventures exploring the creek that morning. "Mr. Miller rode by earlier," Flynn mentioned as they were finishing their pie. "Said Tucker Wilkins is getting married next month to Sarah Peterson, the schoolteacher." Hope raised her eyebrows in surprise. "Really? That's unexpected," Flynn chuckled. "Not so unexpected if you've seen how he looks at her during Sunday services. Reminds me of someone else I know." He winked at Hope, causing her to blush despite their years together. "Well, I wish them happiness," Hope said sincerely. "Sarah's a lovely person, and Tucker, he's grown up considerably since we knew him." Indeed, the years had brought changes to many in Silver Creek. Some of Hope's former tormentors had moved on, seeking opportunity elsewhere as the railroad expanded west. Others, like Tucker, had matured, finding purpose and direction that tempered their youthful cruelty. When they encountered Hope, now respected ranch wife, mother, an accomplished pianist who often played for church services and town gatherings, they treated her with a deference that sometimes amused her, given their shared history. After the children were tucked into bed with stories and kisses, Hope and Flynn sat together on the front porch, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Hope leaned against her husband's shoulder, his arm warm around her waist. "I had a letter from Mrs. Hargrove today," Hope said. "She's considering selling the boarding house and moving to Denver to live with her sister." Flynn nodded thoughtfully. "She's getting on in years. Running that place is a lot of work for someone her age." "She asked if we might be interested in buying it," Hope continued. "As an investment, we could hire someone to manage it day to day." Flynn turned to look at her, surprise evident in his expression. "Would you want that? To own the place where you worked as a housekeeper?" Hope considered the question. "I think I would, not out of any desire to prove something to the town, but because it's a good business with steady income. And—" she hesitated, then continued more softly, "because Mrs. Hargrove gave me work and kindness when I needed both desperately. I'd like to ensure her legacy continues." Flynn's arm tightened around her. "Then we'll look into it," he said simply. "The ranch is doing well enough now that we could consider branching out." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching as the moon rose over the distant mountains, casting silver light across their land. "You ever think about how much has changed?" Hope asked eventually. "How different our lives are now from when we met?" Flynn's lips brushed her temple. "Every day," he admitted. Sometimes I wake up beside you and have to remind myself I'm not dreaming." Hope smiled, turning to face him. In the moonlight, his beloved features were softened, but his eyes still held the same steadfast devotion they had shown her from the beginning. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you hadn't come to Silver Creek," she mused. "If our paths had never crossed." Flynn shook his head. "I don't like to think about that possibility," he said seriously, "but I believe we would have found each other somehow. Some things are meant to be, Hope." The certainty in his voice warmed her from within. Hope reached up to trace the line of his jaw, still marveling at the love that had transformed her life so completely. "You remember what you said to me that day by the creek during our picnic?" she asked softly. "When I couldn't believe you could truly find me beautiful." Flynn's smile was tender. "I remember. I said plain looks like heaven from where I stand." Hope nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "And now," Flynn gathered her closer, his hands gentle but possessive on her waist. "Now I know heaven isn't a place," he murmured against her lips. "It's being exactly where you belong, with the one who sees you, truly sees you, and loves you completely." As their lips met in a kiss that carried the passion of new love and the depth of years shared, Hope knew with absolute certainty that she had found her heaven not in grand gestures or extraordinary beauty, but in the everyday miracle of being truly seen and wholly loved. In the house behind them, their children slept peacefully. Around them, their land stretched in silvery moonlight, the promise of tomorrow written in each blade of grass, each star overhead. And in Flynn's arms, Hope Calloway Thornton, once mocked for being plain, now cherished for being exactly who she was, found the fulfillment of every dream she had ever dared to dream, and many she hadn't even known to hope for. Plain, indeed, looked exactly like heaven from where they both stood.